the bracha, guys, have in mind, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu v'mitzvotav v'tzivanu l'suk b'divrei Torah v'arevna Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Toratcha b'finu v'yivcha beit Yisrael v'niyeh anachnu v'tzetzenu v'tzetzemcha beit Yisrael kulanu yodei shemecha v'lomdei Toratecha lishma Baruch atah Adonai hamlamed Torah le'emo Yisrael.
Amen.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bacha banu mikol hamim v'natan lanu Torato Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
Okay. All right. Now, guys, we're going to go through the Mishnah Brura quickly. Where we are is in section 191, verse 5. And in the Shulchan Aruch, we're in 183, verse 12. And the Bur Halacha, 191, verse 3. Okay. Now, what we're doing is we're discussing about doing other activities while you're doing a bracha or a mitzvah. So it's absolutely prohibited to be busy with something else when you're either benching or you're busy with the mitzvah. However, if you've obviously done something else in the interim, you don't repeat that sort of mitzvah or bracha because then you're using Hashem's name in vain. But it should be fairly obvious to all of you that the reason why you cannot be busy with anything else is that, one, if you're doing another activity, a second thing, how important do you think you assessing the primary thing? If you're multitasking, in other words, if I'm having a conversation with Arthur, and at that particular point in time, I'm looking at my phone, how important do you think I'm giving stock to my conversation with Arthur? If I'm on my phone like this and I say, yeah, Arthur, is it respectful, yes or no? Arthur, everything is springboard for humor.
You're not giving it enough weight.
You're not giving it enough weight. So it's not so the whole reason that before we learned in the previous Mishnah Brura about sitting when you're doing a bracha is you should have no other activity but making Hashem your priority. Hashem's not asking that you that you sit there and bow and scrape. But the only thing is that when you're thanking him for the food that you've got, to have a bit of kavanah and know that there are people in the world that don't have food. When you're thanking Hashem for the fact that we have a state of Israel and we have a homeland in case there's another Holocaust, and that we have got a place where the Holy Temple was built, and it's a privilege for Jewish people to live there. Wake up and concentrate on that. When you're doing a mitzvah and you're helping other people, don't do something half in. This thing about multitasking means that you never do everything 100%. When you juggle balls, you most often drop balls. You have to focus on one thing. So the whole halacha of sitting when you're doing a bracha is focus on what you're doing. So some of the things that you're prevented from doing is as follows. You shouldn't, it says, play or calm a baby down. Now, the reality is it's easier said than done, because if you've got neighbors and you've got a screaming baby, the person that wrote this year, I don't know if they've had to deal with it, most probably. But gesture, definitely what you shouldn't do is start to take items off the table while you're doing the bracha. And if you're a guest at somebody else's home, what you should say is before we bench, you can say, listen, I want to help you clear up. We just need to have kavanah while we bench and focus on benching. In other words, you give your intent to focus, but you also give your intent to help. So all I can tell you is you need to focus on what you're doing and giving 100% concentration. All right, let's go. And speaking of concentration, this took quite a bit of work. All right, so now we've got a bit of a difficulty, because what we had to work out is that there are actually 3 versions of this. So let me just go through what the subject matter is. We're on the 21st daf, and it's the section Aleph, and we're talking about stretching from the public domain to the private domain. So you're stretching from the Rishus Harabim, which is a public domain, to eat from the Rishus Yachid, which is the private domain. So this is the first version of the Mishnah. It says it pays for the benefit. If it ate from the side of the Rechavia, it pays the damage. Okay, so the first version of the Mishnah says, okay, that according to Rav, is that if the animal stretched its neck to eat from the side of the road, then it pays for the damage. Now, when it uses the term it pays for the damage, according to Rashi, half damage, what are we talking about here, guys? Whenever it uses the word pay for damage, it's talking about keren tam. So that's the first version of the Mishnah, according to Rav. Now, according to that first version, Shmuel says, even in that case, it is exempt. It only pays for the benefit. So Shmuel says it's not deemed by him to be unusual behavior when the animal turns its head and goes slightly to the side of the street to eat. He says this is a normal behavior for an animal, and therefore it's not unusual behavior. It's not keren tam, and therefore you don't pay half payment damages. So then, according to this first version of the Mishnah, when does, according to Shmuel, when does the Mishnah obligate paying for that damage? So basically what happens is Shmuel's answer to that is as follows. It's when she left the street altogether and stood on the human portion of the street. So what we described last time is you have a normal wide road, very wide road. And then what happens is on the side, you've got your pedestrian area where you've got stalls. And people, like there's a slight embankment and people walk on the pavement. And some of the areas like partitioned with gating, or what do you call it, with railing, etc. And they're cobble areas where people can walk. So there's definitive areas where there's almost road traffic of animals and private stores where they're displaying their wares. So as far as Shmuel's concerned, if you in that sort of public area where animals go, the fact that the animal can turn its head slightly does not make it unusual, and therefore it's still considered the public domain, and therefore you exempt for shame in the public domain, and all you pay for is what the animal benefited. So for what the animal benefited, what does this mean? What is the definition of the animal benefiting?
When he ate something that was more than just regular.
No, not at all. So what this means, we've been doing it for a week, guys. What this means is that according to Rabbah, if the animal ate its fill of straw for the equivalent of the next meal, according to Rabbah, his student, it's barley at 2/3 its value, meaning you don't pay the 2,000 rands worth of smoked salmon your animal gobbled up. That's paying for shame, what the animal consumed. You're paying purely the value of the animal's next meal because the animal burps and the animal's happy, and now you don't have to pay for the next meal. So you pay the equivalent of a can of EPOL or whatever if your dog ate, the equivalent. But that's not paying for shame. That's paying for the animal's next meal. Paying for shame is paying for what the animal consumed. Okay, good. So according to Shmuel, even on the first version, the animal would have to leave the street, the main street. Right, now let's look at the second version and see what's going on. Now, the second version is very clear. Version 2, if the animal stretched out its neck to eat from the side of the public domain, it pays full damage. And this is according to Rav. Now, you should see that version 2 is different to version 1. Version 1 says we pay for the damage. Okay? And version 2, according to Rav, said it pays full damage because the categories are different. Gavin, when I say that you pay for half damage, what does this imply?
Keren.
Correct. So according to the first version of the Mishnah, Rav is talking that it's unusual damage because the animal turns its head and veers off to the side. Therefore, you pay because of the unusualness half payment because it's a keren tam. In the second version of Rav, we're saying that you pay full damage. And why is this? Not because it's keren. This is the trick. Kevin, why do you think?
Why do I think that you pay?
What does full damage mean? What does full damage mean in this case?
If the animal gets full benefit and eats like normally, if it's like normal in the private domain, if they eat.
Okay, you hit on something. Stop there. You hit on it. So Rav's second version. Just give me a chance, Kev, because Kevin needs a chance. Kevin's correct. Is that when you hit on the private domain? So what Kevin said here is very good. Kevin is saying that according to Rav's second version, which is accurate, when the animal stretches to the side and eats, he's now technically at the entrance of the store. But whose property is that? Is it public domain or private domain? Arth, you're on mute.
It's actually public domain.
Okay, according to the second version, you're right. According to the first version, it's public domain. You're absolutely right. But according to the second domain, because how you write in the first version, because when we say half damages, it could be the public or private. Why? Because keren tam, not according to Rabbi Tarfon, but according to the rabbi's general opinion, you pay half damages for keren tam, whether you're in the private domain or the public domain. Only Rabbi Tarfon says you pay full damages in the private domain. Okay? You're right. Whether it's the public or the private, you pay half damages for keren, unusual. According to Rav's second opinion, you pay full damages, which implies it's shame, which means when the animal veers off to the entrance of the store to eat in the store, you've now entered the private domain of the store. So that's according to the second version. Okay, so either is holding like Rabbi Tarfon, which says it's not shame. It would be shame, because whether you say it's full damages for the unusualness because it's a private domain, or you pay full damages because it's shame, it's the private domain, it's still considered, according to the second version, private domain at the entrance of the store because the guy owns the store. First version, it's the public domain, half damages for unusual, according to Rav. So how does Shmuel rule on the second version? Same as before. Shmuel says the animal's owner is exempt. And according to the Mishna, when does Shmuel say that you pay for shame damage? It says when the animal leaves the road entirely and goes to the private area off the street. Okay, so his opinion in the first Mishnah and the second version of the Mishnah, it's one Mishnah, but two versions, is the same. The only difference we see here is Rav in the first version sees it as keren tam, of which you pay half damages. The second version, you could say it's within eating of the private domain at the entrance of the store. It's considered part of the store. So therefore it would be shame because you're eating in the private domain in the field of another. Or you could say he's holding according to Rabbi Tarfon and you're saying it's keren tam, but in the private domain where there's full payment damages. Either way, it's a private domain. Okay, that's the second version. And Shmuel on both versions is of the same opinion. That turning your head is not merely considered good enough. The animal has to actually do something so unusual by going in the public walkway and off the main street, okay, into the side of the street where people are. Right, now let's Arthur go on the third version. So Arthur's right here. You hit on it, mate. That was very good. All right, now let's go on the third version. Now, before we go to the third version, there's a question. Now, guys, the question was by Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak. And in the Mishnah, he asks a question of Rav. And the question of Rav he asked, it says in the Mishnah that he ate from the entrance of the store, it paid what it benefited. So the suggestion in the Mishnah, isn't this a case when it stretched out its neck? Okay, so what the question is that he's asking on Rav, and this is very important. This is where I need you guys to unmute, because I want you might have questions. Rav is saying in the first case that you pay half payment damages for keren tam. In the second version, it's the same Mishnah. Second reading of the version is you pay full damages, which would imply either shame or that is holding like Rabbi Tarfon, where it pays what it damaged and it's private domain, so therefore it's full payment. But either way, it's the private domain. But it's not the wording of the Mishnah, because the wording of the Mishnah says it pays what it's benefited. Now, whenever you see the word pay what it's benefited, it implies that you don't pay for shame. because it's the public domain. Because Shane would mean you don't pay what it benefits, you pay what it ate. So if it ate 200 shekels worth of smoked salmon, you would pay what it consumed. Paying what it benefited means you don't pay for Shane in the public domain, you just pay the equivalent of the animal's next meal. So that's indication that you don't pay for Shane in the public domain. You with me, mate?
Yeah, I'm here.
Since that is the case, Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak is saying no, it doesn't make sense, because if the Mishnah said it ate from the entrance of the store, it pays what it benefited. How could Rav turn around and say it paid what it's damaged for carrying time half payment, or it pays full damages? Because that's not payment what's benefited. If you're paying for Shane, you're paying the full amount of what it consumed. You're not paying a benefit of the next meal. If it's carried, you're paying what it damaged, not what it benefited. So that's his question on Rav. And it's a suggestion, isn't this the case when it stretched its neck? So the Gemara's answer is no. The case is the store on the corner of the alley that the animal can eat without stretching its neck. Okay, so this is what it's saying, is that if you have a very narrow road, so after you had a normal side-wide road, and now you've got a very, very small road where animals are walking and they're hardly stretching, and it's right by them, and they're not doing anything unusual, and the food's right there. Obviously, the animal's going to consume. So if the store owner is that stupid to create that sort of store where the animal doesn't have to put in any effort, even then, Rav would say that it's not unusual for the animal to eat, because the animal wouldn't have to turn its head. The animal would just actually exert no effort, and therefore Rav would exempt even Rav in the case and say the animal's owner pay what the animal benefited, because the person shouldn't have created this store where the street starts to narrow. Okay. It doesn't make any sense. So then that's the person's problem. So Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak asked the question and said, this is the question we'd have on Rav, and he answered the question and said, this is how Rav would answer it. Okay. Now, we're about to hit version 3. Now, version 3 is as follows. It's saying that Rav and Shmuel both agree that if the animal stretched its neck to eat food from the side of the public road, it pays the damage. So in this third version and interpretation of the Mishnah, it's saying that Rav and Shmuel are in agreement. Then if the animal does something unusual, it uses the term pays the damage. Whenever it uses the word damage, we know it means keren. And keren tam if it's for the first 3 offenses. Therefore, you pay half payment damages. So in this third version interpretation of the Mishnah, it says Rav and Shmuel agree that if the animal turns its head and eats, it pays what it damaged. So they say, okay, I get it, but where is the bone of contention? Where's the dispute actually about? Right. So now we're getting to the heart of it. A different version of the dispute between Rav and Shmuel. There are those who say that when she turns her head to eat from what is on the side, all agree that she's liable for damages. When do they argue? In the case of one sets apart his part of his domain for the public domain. So what we are saying here is as follows. Is last time what we discussed is that I've got a store. Now, generally what happens with the stores is that they've got, Kevin, the entrance that was covered. So in other words, we've got a store, and you can think of it like the Macaulay art when we used to stay in Gillow, right? Yeah. Where like no animals could get in because you've got a narrow door and there's a full shop. And once you go in the shop, you've got your display shelves and your trays, and it's small enough for somebody to walk in, and there's a bit of aircon, and all the stores are covered. You've got a public pedestrian road, but animals couldn't get in there because in those days there wasn't the SPCA. They would have cracked the animal with a broom to chase it out. Believe me, this was not an age where animals' rights were a big deal. They made sure that the animal was knocked out and kicked out the store. So in those days, you had the wall. Now you have one owner on the street, mate, that what they do here is he decides to take off the, what do you call it, the awning in his shop and the barricades and decides to open it up to the public. So he's got more of an open display area. That we went to Beta Fruit. Do you remember that place?
Yeah.
So what happened there is the guy had like shade cloth awning and all the fruit and vegetables were there on display. And we're talking about the case like that, where it was still his private shop, but anybody could get access to it. And then you had the inner part where there were the tools and the narrow area. Now, this is the case where there's a discussion. So in this case, we're going to discuss what they would say. So in other words, it was all private and he opened it up to the public, but he still owns all that area. So this is the discussion. So basically, Rav said that if one set aside part of his domain for the use of the public domain, and the animal eats food that is left there, you're not liable for the damages. Shmuel said even when one sets aside part of his domain for the use of the public domain, and an animal eats food there, she is liable for the damages. Okay. So again, Kevin, there's a case. The store is closed up. The person opens it up. They're displaying their fruits and vegetables. Rav says that if your animal comes to eat there, you're not liable to pay. Shmuel said it's still private property and you are liable to pay. That's the bottom line when you open up your store for the public. It's still privately owned, but there's greater access. Now, we're going to hit another issue here. So there was, now Shmuel and Rav, they were Amoraim, okay? Now you have Tanaim. Now Tanaim come before them and therefore they've got greater authority. So the two Tanas that we're talking about is that the Gemara wants to know, does this resemble an earlier argument between Rabbi Akiva and Rav Ishmael? And this argument occurs in the following. It's in 49b. So this is the argument, right? Now, what happens is if one makes a pit in his property and then abandons ownership of the property without abandoning ownership of the pit. Now, there are three distinct features here. Kev, are you with me? Okay, so what we're saying is, we learned in the third B, in 3B, in Daf 3B, about what happens if you create a pit in the public domain. Now, there was a case between Rav and Shmuel, where initially, if you create it in the public domain, there's a difference between what you call ownerless and what you don't call ownerless. So if it's ownerless, if you remember, Shmuel said, and what is the case that Arthur and I discussed before? We're walking in Ben Yehuda Street and I've got a cell phone and I drop my cell phone and somebody slips on it and they land up in traction like this in the hospital. And the person, and I turn around and say, no, it's not my cell phone. I've given up ownership of it. I'm not responsible. You can't say that because you wouldn't give up your cell phone. Because if anybody took that cell phone of yours and phoned you up and said, listen, I found your phone. It's got invaluable information on it. It's got your contact list, everything on your WhatsApp messages. Do you want it? If your answer is yes, have you given up ownership of that pit or that obstruction? Yes or no?
No.
No. Why? Because you want that article. It's only when you're going to be sued you say, I know nothing. So what we talk about here is a case where you haven't abandoned that obstruction or that pit. That's what we talk about. And we say Shmuel, according to Shmuel's opinion, whether you've abandoned that pit that you've made or you haven't abandoned it in terms of your affinity for it, in that particular case, you're responsible. If it's a hazard in the public domain, you're responsible. And then Rav says the following. He says, no, well, what you can do is you can use the common characteristic. So the pit is stationary and it's prone to damage from inception. Okay? And the fact of it is we're responsible for our ox, which is our property. And you can derive from there that you're responsible for the damage your property does, mixed with the prone to damage from inception from the pit. So whether it's ownerless or not, it doesn't make a difference. You're obligated, but for two different reasons. Here we're talking about a different case. We're talking about where you had private property, maybe you couldn't make the bond anymore, whatever, and then you just left it for the public, and then there are vagrants that come in, etc., like their properties in Orange Grove, like that. Now we're saying that you might have abandoned the property. Say you had to leave and quickly go overseas, and you abandoned it. You haven't abandoned that obstruction of that pit. Let me give you an example of what a pit would be.
Okay.
A pit could be a swimming pool. Why you spend 40 grand building the pool? You might have left a lawnmower there that's worth 4 grand. You haven't abandoned that lawnmower. You spend 4 grand. You're going to take it to your new property. But yet it's a hazard. So there's a case where you haven't abandoned that particular ditch. It's not like you've abandoned a ditch. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So this is where you make a pit in your property and you abandon the ownership of the property without abandoning ownership of the pit. So this is a Tanaic dispute between Rav Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva. So Rabbi Akiva rules that the former owner is liable for the damage caused by his pit, because by abandoning the property he has thereby made it part of the public domain, and has thus, in effect, made a pit in the public domain. Rav Yishmael, however, frees the former from liability because the owner can claim, I didn't abandon my property in order to become liable for damages and lawsuits. That's according to Rashi and Tosfot. So those are the points of view. Okay. So now what we're proposing here is this case of Rav. And what we're saying is maybe Rav made you liable, maybe in this particular case, where Rav says you're not liable for damages, where's Arthur? So Rav is saying that you're not liable for damages if your animal eats in that private domain that's now been opened up to the public. And the Gemara wants to suggest, what it's saying is here that Rav, basically it wants to suggest that the reason why Rav doesn't obligate your animal to eat in this private domain that's now been opened up for access for the public is because it considers that he holds like Rabbi Akiva, which basically says that you're liable for a pit in the property. Okay? You're liable for a pit in the property. So it's the Gemara suggesting maybe it holds but like Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Akiva holds as follows, is that if you create a pit in the public domain, in other words, it was in your private domain and now you've let your property go to the public, that pit is a hazard. And therefore you're responsible for lawsuits. So anybody that removes those hazards from your property that has now become public, they don't owe you anything for that damage. They're actually removing a hazard to prevent you having lawsuits and people hurting themselves. And therefore, you can consider fruit that's dropped on the floor all over and a person has a fruit store as a hazard that people could slip and you could be liable. And since you're liable for lawsuits, now that you opened up your thoroughfare to the public and it's not a true private domain, in that particular case, anybody that removes those hazards are not liable for removing your hazards because they're removing dangers and they're removing you from having lawsuits. So if an animal eats those fruits in the public domain, what they've done is they've removed your hazards, and therefore, because they removed your hazards, which you left in the public domain, which you're liable for by opening up your property, that's the reason why the animal is not obligated to pay for fruit that it and food that it consumed. So that's the reason it wants to propose, right? And then Shmuel that says you are liable for fruit that your animal consumes in the public domain, that is actually technically private but opened up to the public. He says no, you wouldn't be sued because the Gemara is proposing that he's holding like Rav Yishmael, who's a Tana that says that basically when you open up your private property to the public, you're not responsible for getting sued then because you've done the public a favor. People have to look and see where the hazards are. So that's what the Gemara is proposing, right? So the fruits basically represent a pit for people or animals who might walk on them and slip on them. So Rav holds that the former owner of the property is liable for lawsuits and damages that would be caused by the fruits he has spread there. And his ruling is that the reason why the animal's owner does not pay for the fruit is explained, because the rule is if one places fruit or pits or danger areas in the public domain illegally, not only is he liable for damages, but anyone may take possession of those pits. And certainly no one is liable for damaging them or consuming them. So that's why he rules that the animal's owner is not responsible if the animal consumes those hazards. Whereas Shmuel says he's absolutely within his rights to leave his fruit there, because although anyone may take possession of the pit, it doesn't apply here. Why? Because this is technically that Shmuel rules that the animal's owner must pay for the damages, because this is not shown in the public domain. This is not a true public domain, because where the animals have the right to eat, because technically it's private property that's been opened up, and that private property that's been opened up is meant for human beings to walk and view the wares that the shop is trying to sell, and it's not a place for animals. It is private domain. Okay, so I'm just we're on 21b1 now. Okay, so we're gonna say, so can we say that these Amoraim mimic the Tanaim with their reasons? In other words, is the pit in the property a reason? And the Gemara answers that the two disputes are not interrelated, because Rav could in fact say to you something completely different. He could say that in general, one is not liable for a pit in his property. Okay, in other words, in this particular case, in fact, Rav could, instead of holding the view of Rabbi Akiva, could hold the view of Rabbi Yishmael, who says that no one is liable for making a pit in the where one's private property became public. This is not a case of making a pit in the public domain. Everybody agrees that you can't do that. So it's saying that this argument of pit doesn't prove anything, because we can just say here just as well that Rav agrees with Rabbi Akiva, or he agrees with Rav Yishmael, and that in general you're not liable for a pit in the property. It's different here, because in the case that one who spreads out his fruit in the land, he's given over to the public domain. The animal's owner could basically say to him, look, Gavin, this is your fruit stall. It was nice and closed. Now you made it open where everybody could get access. Why is my animal now responsible for eating in your property? Because you've made it open to the public and you've allowed access there. So why is my cow responsible for eating there? Because it's not within your rights that you should bring your fruit near to the public domain. In other words, you've opened it up right by the street. You haven't created any sort of privacy, and you're surprised when animals that are right there eat by that. And now you want to obligate me. You should have had measures in place. So that's what Rav could say to you, and that's why you're not responsible. Now, Shmuel could say in general, he could say, even hold by Rabbi Akiva and say one is liable for a pit in his property if he abandons that property to the public. So we've just proved here that Rav and Shmuel can agree with either Rabbi Akiva or Rav Yishmael. They can agree with both. We've given logic. So Shmuel's ruling is different. He could say, listen, in general, you're liable for a pit in your property if you abandon that property to the public. But that ruling is fine in the case of an actual pit, because it could be said that the animal didn't see that has it. But here, in the present case of fruits, can it be said that the animal is not aware of them? Why, it sees them. So what it's saying is, listen, you can't use the pit as an example, because if the animal didn't see your fruit, it wouldn't eat the fruit. And therefore, you can't use that argument of pit by holding neither by Rav Yishmael or Rabbi Akiva in this case, because Rav and Shmuel could interrelatedly agree with both opinions. So it's not mirroring the Tanaic dispute at all. And all it's saying here is that at the end of the day, is that Rav is saying, listen, you exposed yourself and opened yourself up to the public. The animal's not responsible for eating their. Shmuel's saying that it's still your private domain, and that at the end of the day, that if the animal eats there, it's the owner's responsibility, because that place is only meant for a human walkway. It's not meant for animals, Kev. It's not meant for animals. It's meant as a private shop to be extended, and you have to watch your animal. So those are the two opinions of Rav and Shmuel. And we're going to end off on that note. Arthur, how's